Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding. His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Hi, I'm Gabe Lyons, and welcome to the final edition of the Q Ideas podcast in 2022. And this is my absolute favorite episode of the year. And the reason is we get to comb through everything we've done, all the conversations we've talked about, all the different amazing speakers, thought leaders, experts, practitioners, and comb for our best, what we believe are critical ideas that truly have consequences in the way we live our lives, in the way we practice faithfulness in this moment. And I know for many of you, you're coming into the end of the year, you're tired, you're feeling more maybe chaos, confusion. I've talked to so many different leaders who feel a sense of just being down, being depressed, being oppressed, feeling like they're having a hard time, like seeing forward and seeing clearly and building confidence. Well, I hope that the investment of these next 45 minutes to an hour just give you a sense of presence, a sense of grounding as a leader as you navigate what the future might look like, a way of simplifying what it means to be a Christian and a follower of Jesus in the midst of confusing times. And that is our mission here, and has been for 20 years, is literally to come alongside leaders, parents, school teachers, business leaders, entrepreneurs, scientists, pastors, people who are really trying to navigate faithfully a confusing cultural moment, but one that we know faithfulness is part of the light that God wants to bring into this environment and into those that you love, you care for, you get to work alongside, and that we would be people of joy in the midst of a season where when we think about joy to the world, the Lord has come, it actually has a real tangible presence in the way we live our lives, the way we think about the moment, and the way we lead conversations with those we love. And so not only do we want to go through our top 10 moments, and that's what this episode does, we're going to take you through a little tour of top 10 ideas that were presented this year. I'm going to introduce different moments so that you can kind of enjoy like these prescient moments that were standing ovation kind of moments within our environments where people just felt their heart leap. Like, this is true. This is true. This is what I need. This is what the world needs. And what we want to do is make this available to you over this Christmas break as you move into Christmas, New Year's. I know things will be busy, but there are going to be a few of those moments where you get to be intentional with those you love. For me, it's with my teenage children, and it's sitting around and having some real substantive conversations about the state of the world, about the state of our faith, about how we see our role as people who follow Jesus in the midst of an environment like this. And I think a talk or two from what you're about to hear would be an incredible way to start a conversation of substance where you leave that conversation maybe an hour later with your family or friends and you go, man, that was one of the best conversations I've had in a long time. That's helping me think well about the moment. It's restoring my confidence that God is in the midst of all of this and that there's a real opportunity for how we can move forward as Christians who want to be the church and want to bring life to those who are around us. And so you're going to have access not only to these moments, as you always would at qideas.org, but when you go to qideas.org/Christmas, all 10 of the talks that represent these little moments are going to be there and available for you. So I would encourage you, pick one, maybe pick two, use it for your own personal growth, your own deep encouragement, but think about what's a conversation you need to be having with people around you, the ones that you love the most as you prepare for the year ahead. Well, with our first moment, I want to jump in with Malcolm Gladwell. So Malcolm's been a longtime friend of Q Ideas. He's been a part of so many different events and environments that we've hosted, and this year was no different. We wanted to talk about cancel culture, and that's an idea that I know has had its time. I mean, we've seen that taking place really over the last 5 years, multiple people walking through this idea of cancel culture, but it's become more of an attitude. It's become more of a perspective that's so pervasive now that means our worlds are starting to close off. We're creating these echo chambers. We're having a hard time listening to people who've made mistakes in the past or understanding what is the path back. Is there even redemption for someone who's been canceled? And Malcolm helped frame up what's really going on with cancel culture in light of what we believe as Christians. And so let's listen in now to Malcolm Gladwell describe the reason for cancel culture.
We've fallen out of practice with forgiveness. And that's what's going on here. I don't think it's any more complicated than that. Cancel culture is a direct consequence of a generation of people who have grown up in a culture that no longer puts the ethic of forgiveness at the core of what it means to operate in the world, right? That when you don't have that discipline, and it's a discipline, right? If you grow up in the church and you have people on a daily, weekly basis talking about how for Jesus, forgiveness was everything, right? If you take that out, if you don't hear that word and practice that ethic, then cancel culture is the natural consequence.
Don't you just love hearing Malcolm talk about the ethic of forgiveness and just how central that is to our faith? And the fact that, man, what does it really mean to forgive 70 times 70? What does it mean to bring forgiveness into the conversation today? Something that we as Christians must advance, because we know in our world today that's really not part of the options on the table. And so as we consider those around us that maybe have done something, they've wronged us, there's something that's in between you and a relationship, what does it mean to really practice forgiveness? Well, the next moment was with Ben and Kirsten Watson, and some of you may have seen Ben Watson or been a fan. He's someone who's a Super Bowl winner, a tight end for multiple teams. His career ended up with the New England Patriots. He was with the Saints, very outspoken. But here's a man who's been married for so many years to Kirsten Watson, and they have 7 children. And I wanted to talk to them about parenting. And as you move into this season of, if you're a parent or a grandparent, and you think about what does an eternal perspective look like on raising these young ones? What does it mean for us to think well about that, and what it means to prepare these children for culture, for the world that they're walking in? How do we help them think maybe differently and be okay being part of the counterculture? I think you're going to be encouraged when you hear their thoughts.
Yeah, I think the number one thing is we want to have an eternal perspective. And so we want to parent our kids in the present with eyes on the future. And so that informs the decisions that we make with the kids right now. If we're thinking about our children in 5 years or 15 years, then it'll tell us that we need to lean into all the things that are happening in the culture. So many times as a parent, I don't know about you, but I want to protect my kids from everything. I don't want them to watch the news. I don't want them to experience being bullied. I don't want them to experience failure, or not getting a great grade on the test, whatever it is. I want to protect them. But part of understanding that our job as parents, God has given us these children for a specific amount of time to return him into adults that will be people who will honor him and then reproduce themselves. And so overarching, when we look at that perspective of parenting, it means, I have to, even though I'm tired, I have to discipline them. Yeah. I have to, even though I'm tired, I have to teach them the word of God. I have to put it in them because I know it will reap benefits for them later on. Yeah. I have to open their eyes to current events and how to deal with things like race and culture, things like other worldviews. Mm-hmm. They have to be able to deal with, like I mentioned before, failure or whatever, the phones, whatever it is. They have to be able to process these things with a biblical worldview, because if I don't teach them, somebody else is.
Yeah.
I think another thing we talk about in our family is it's okay to be by yourself. This idea that you don't have to be in the popular crowd. I think sometimes as parents, we want them to be in the best of this and everybody love them. And I think we always talk about if you don't have any friends because you're standing up for something, that's okay. We're preparing our kids for trial, because if everything is perfect for them, when they are standing up for something and no one else is joining them, it's going to be really hard to do. If we don't prepare them and show them in God's word where it says, choose joy in trial, you will be persecuted, all these things that we say. And if we don't allow them to experience it and allow them to go and step in it in their own way as a third grader. And I said, somebody was we have countless stories of things that happen in school, and our kids are like, and then I was called a name. Mm-hmm. But I didn't do anything wrong. And I was like, when we process, how does that feel? So it's like you're discipling your kid. I feel like we're discipling them through this life. And sometimes our suggestions or the way that we parent them doesn't say like, well, they hit you as long as you don't hit them first. And all these things that we tell them, like, well, that's not biblical. What does the Bible say we should do with our enemies? And that's hard. That's hard to tell a fourth grader that you're supposed to still pray for that person when they're leaving you out. And so we use real life stuff and the truth of the Bible all the time. We go back to Genesis all the time. Like, well, how did God create it? Then what happened? Okay, so then how does that play into what's happening in the classroom?
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's what we try to do with our kids now, because there's so much, and so much we can't prepare them for, but we can ask them, hey, what's going on? Yeah. What does that look like? How did that make you feel? What would be the right thing to do? And how did you react? How could that be different? It's all of those questions that open the conversation, because we are their first teacher. Yeah. The church is not the first teacher. We are.
I love hearing Kirsten just describe teaching her little children to understand that sometimes you're just going to stand out. You're going to be different, and that's okay. That's what it means to be a person of conviction. As you're listening to these special moments that took place during the year, I want you to know that you can be in the room and be with us and join with other leaders who, like you, are trying to faithfully navigate this cultural moment at our Culture Summit in 2023, April 27 and 28 in Nashville. This year, over 25 talks, just like the ones that you're listening to in this moment, that are going to help you think well about the future. And they're not only going to help you think well, they're going to help you know how to lead these conversations when you go back into the environment to which you've been called. You're going to feel hopeful, encouraged. You're going to experience the joy of being together with other leaders, 900 people in one room together, all together trying to discover what is God doing in this moment and how do we lead this forward, not just for our generation, but for the next generation. And so I want to encourage you, go to qideas.org/culture summit. There you can see all of the ways that you can purchase tickets. There's only 200 remaining at this moment. So take advantage of going ahead and reserving your seats. When you reserve 2 or more, we have a holiday bundle that you can take advantage of if you register before the end of the year. That includes beautiful sackcloth and ashes blanket, an incredible painting, print that you can enjoy. You can see all of this online at qideas.org/culture summit. And when you register, you'll see all of the benefits of doing that today and reserving your seats and just saying now, look, in 2023, I'm going to make this a part of my growth plan. And I'm going to bring a friend with me, or I'm going to bring a team with me. I'm going to get a table of 8 and actually have my whole team sit around and not only learn together, but this year we're bringing back our city experiences that are going to allow you to get out in the city, perhaps choose an industry or a recreational event you'd love to do with some other leaders where you not only enjoy and play a bit and learn, but you also have a substantive conversation with others who care about the things you care about. So join us at qideas.org/culture summit. We're going to shift gears a little bit because one of the people who's living that out now in their career as a person of conviction is Dr. Aaron Cariotti. Now, Dr. Cariotti is one of the foremost leaders in the movement of understanding bioethics, and he's applied his practice and helped so many others become educated on an area that a lot of people haven't thought deeply about in our modern culture, and yet the questions are coming in every day, every week about what does it mean to be human? How do we think about the future where medical advances are coming at us quickly, and there's lots of decisions to be made about at what point is this okay, morally or ethically, to enhance what it means to be human? At what point is it great for healing our bodies? And at what point is it downright creating major issues, and it's actually trying to redesign something that God's already made beautiful? Dr. Aaron Cariotti and I had a long conversation. I would encourage you to watch this entire 18-minute dialogue because we talked a lot about gene therapy and bioethics and some of these big questions that need to be answered. But in this particular moment, he talks about a transhuman future. And if that's not a term that you're familiar with, we've done multiple talks on transhumanism where you could learn more about that particular topic. But it really starts to get into these questions about what does it mean to be human and where are those limitations. And our next few moments are going to help you hear different perspectives on that being the question of the hour. This being one of the most important considerations for a Christian leader to be contemplating and reflecting and starting to make real decisions on about where are your lines, how are you going to advance good thinking around this in those that you care about, those people that you're leading and the institutions that you are leading. And I hope you'll not only hear this moment, but dig into this conversation because it's going to be a critical one in the years ahead.
So what we've seen in the last 20 years, what's accelerated during the pandemic, is the rise of what some people have called the biomedical security state, which sounds like a sort of scary thing coming down the pike, a totalitarian type regime that we may be living under in the future. But the basic idea is that we've seen a merging of three things: public health, digital technologies of surveillance and control, facilitated by smartphones and other novel technologies, and the police powers of the state to coerce certain things that people may or may not want to accept. And with this confluence of these three things, I think we're entering a period of time in which we need to think very, very carefully about issues related to privacy, about issues related to personal autonomy, about issues related to our embodied existence. So I mentioned this term Gnosticism earlier. In the early days of Christianity, Gnostic religions were sort of the main competitor to Christianity, and sometimes passed themselves off as sort of quasi-Christian. But the basic idea behind Gnosticism was that the material world is something that we need to overcome. And the ancient Gnostics tried to overcome it by escaping from the world into a kind of higher realm. I think the neo-Gnostics, today's transhumanists, try to escape the material realm by this sort of utopian future. It's a sort of horizontal version of the same mistake. But our physical embodiment is not something that we as Christians can reject. The doctrine of creation, the doctrine of the incarnation, that God became man and took on human flesh, does not allow us to reject the flesh because it was created by God and redeemed by Christ. So it's broken, it's wounded by original sin, we're subject to illness, disease, and disability, and we have to contend with that. But we also have to have a basic regard for nature and for human nature and for what is given in creation. This idea that my body is just pure raw material that can be manipulated any which way I want is bound to backfire. In the interest of making us more than human, which is the transhumanist dream, we're going to end up dehumanizing ourselves and enslaving ourselves to whether it's technologies or whether it's the control and surveillance of other people that have particular financial interests or political motivations or whatever. I think these trends that we're seeing in this direction that we're moving in is something that all of us as Christians need to be paying close attention to.
Now, as we move from this conversation with Dr. Cariotti into another one, you'll see the theme continue. We had Dr. Kelly Kapic, and he's the professor of theological studies at Covenant College. And man, he shared one of the most convicting talks about this idea of creatures having limits. And you hear that word creatures, and I know when I hear it, at first I think creatures. Mate, is that animals? Does that apply to me? And you realize, of course it applies to us. Human beings, we are creatures made in God's image, but we do have limitations. And this is the bigger worldview that we're all being confronted with now, is a vision for a future, whether it's transhumanism, whether it's the use of biotechnology to advance what it means to be human. There's a real press against limits, a real press that says, I'm not sure I want to live within the restrictions or the confinements that perhaps it is required for me to live in, to be a healthy, flourishing human being. I want to push the boundaries. I want to explore what it might look like for me to be a little more like God. And so this has always been a temptation, but we're finally at a place where the technology, the science, the medicine, it's all catching up to where this is a real conversation, and it's starting to impact every area of our society as it relates to health, as it relates to our well-being, as it relates to a vision for what does it actually mean to be human, what does it mean for our children to be born and to deal with disease and sickness, or to be designed in such a way that perhaps they avoid that. These are the questions of limits. And does God put limits on what it means to be human? Well, Dr. Kapic is going to give us a bit of a moment that helps us understand the gift of limitations.
I've become convinced that we don't have a time management problem. We have a theological and a pastoral problem, and it's hurting us. And the root of this problem for so many of us is that we have confused finitude and sin. We've confused finitude. I know it's the word we don't use a lot. We've confused finitude and sin. Let me explain, because finitude is just a fancy term for the limits of time, space, knowledge, power, etc. Right? That's what it means. And in Christian terms, it's actually all we mean when we confess that we are creatures. You see, only the Creator is infinite. All the rest of creation, including humanity, is shaped by limits and dependence. But when individuals and entire cultures forget this, then what it does is it drives us away from the life-giving relationships we're meant to have with God, our neighbors, and the rest of creation. No. What if I told you that the way to the flourishing life is only found when we recognize and live within our creaturely limits? And that will only be possible when we grow to honor our dependence. I know it's not a great word in the West. When we learn to honor our dependence on what is outside of us. Here's the thing. Before there was any sin, before there was any fall, by God's good design, He made humans to be dependent. It's part of the good design. To be dependent upon God, to be dependent upon our neighbors, to be dependent on the rest of the creation, upon the earth.
I love how Dr. Kapik reminds us of this dependency, right? That this is part of what it means to be human. We can't do this alone. We need other people. We need God. We were never designed to just be independently supernatural. And so that leads us into another moment with Andy Crouch. Now, Andy Crouch has just been someone from the very first moment that we created the Culture Summit in 2007, where his voice was a key voice in shaping so much of my thinking, but also our thinking about what does it mean to be a people that care about cultural renewal, that understand that God's called us to have dominion and also to be part of renewing and restoring all things through the power of the Spirit working through us, but also as part of what it means to be a witness of His goodness in the world. And so Andy continues us down this path and this theme of recognizing what he refers to as modern magic and the temptation of modern magic and how much it can start to dilute us and remove us from truly seeing who we are as humans. Now, as you listen to this, I hope it just continues to encourage your spirit right now as you feel maybe down or you're dealing with some of the difficult realities of our current moment, that you'll start to feel encouraged. You're not alone. The fact that you might realize you're dependent or that there isn't necessarily a magical way out of this will encourage you that God is with you and that He has a plan, even in these moments, to restore and renew all things. Let's listen now to Andy Crouch.
But God, who created us, became like us. Deus homo factus est. Homo deus, this alchemical idea, gets both humanity and God wrong. Human beings are not imprisoned spirits that deserve unlimited control over the world. We are constitutionally creatures whose every breath is a gift. And the God who made us is not a magician or a sorcerer who coerces the world into conformity. God was actually able to become human and remain fully God because of the goodness of the creation of the world and the goodness of being created human. And when that fullness of God and fullness of humanity came into being, it came into being in a totally pre-technological time. None of our modern magic was needed for the most fully human person, the most fully divine person who's ever lived to bring flourishing wherever he went. So we should know that this is not our dream. We should also know that because it is not real, when we attempt to practice magic, it does not actually elevate us out of our human condition. It diminishes us. It doesn't raise us to the status of God. It causes us to dwindle to the status of things. Apprenticing yourself to a sorcerer does not actually ever turn you into a sorcerer, but it definitely can turn you into a broom. I was giving a talk about the Sorcerer's Apprentice recently, and someone raised his hand and said, I don't feel like a sorcerer. I do feel like a broom a lot of the time. The quest to make machines that magically act like humans, probably not going to work, but we'll get really good at making humans act like machines. That we can do. So the church has always insisted that its members renounce magic. But we just haven't sufficiently appreciated, we modern Christians, that magic is still here and must still be renounced. We don't need to renounce the discoveries of science and their genuine benefits for human beings, but we need more than ever to renounce the dream. Every time we're tempted to seek abundance without dependence, every time we're tempted to wield instant, effortless power, we need to recognize these things do not lead to good. They corrupt and destroy the creatures of God. We need a resistance movement to the dream of alchemy disguised as science and as technological improvement.
Are you hearing the theme now? I mean, Andy's moment connected with Kelly Kapic, before that, Dr. Cariotti, you can just see how there's an emerging idea here that we are creatures, we need dependency. God's designed us for that. That leads to our actual flourishing the moment we recognize that. It doesn't mean that we don't look forward. It doesn't mean that we don't live into the calling that he has for us, but it also means we can never do that alone. We were never designed to do that alone. In fact, we miss out on the beauty of his creation and the beauty of his plans when we try to do it on our own. Our next moment invites another doctor to be with us, Bill Struthers, and he is someone who we invited to speak about psychedelics. Now, psychedelics is becoming one of the most quickly used by so many people, types of drugs and experiences that are giving people a sense of transcendence. And we wanted to press into that a little bit. What's going on there? Why is there such a draw to this? As well as, how do we think well about this as Christians? How should we think about shrooms? How should we think about these new ideas where our children or 20-somethings are saying, hey, this is a part of my experience now. This is part of how I connect with God and connect with others. Should we be excited about this, or are there questions that we should be asking? And in typical Culture Summit fashion, as you've come to expect, we press into that idea. And Dr. Struthers helps us understand how some people use psychedelics to actually feel connected to God, but for us as Christians, we don't need that to enhance our experience with God.
And so what we're going to find is that, well, these psychedelic drugs are distinct from psychotropic drugs. A number of you enjoyed your psychotropics over lunch, right? Your caffeine. Right? Maybe some of you use tobacco. But psychotropic drugs change your mind, but psychedelic drugs will alter your perception, your ability to see things clearly, right? Psychedelic drugs will give you what's sometimes referred to as a noetic insight, a feeling that you've somehow got some sort of new piece of divine wisdom or knowledge that's been imparted to you. Something that we can't find anywhere else, anywhere in, like, say, a book, like this noetic insight. God is love. You're supposed to laugh at that. You're Christians. You don't need to party to know that. It's in your book, right? Well, some people are looking for those kinds of noetic insights. Others actually are more interested in the feeling of God is love, right? Sort of emotional sense of the presence of the divine. That's what they're looking for in these psychedelic drugs. And there are some that can give you that kind of feeling. It's a counterfeit feeling, but it's a feeling nonetheless.
And Dr. Struthers calling out the counterfeit feelings, right, that we're longing for. This is deep in every human being's soul, to be known by God, to be loved by God, to feel those feelings. And yet for us to recognize that these are counterfeits. These aren't the real thing. They're just a way that people can sense something that lets them know there's a truer thing here, but maybe they don't discover it because they're finding it in a different type of distraction. Well, we invited Brad Gray. He's someone who's a Bible scholar, who's someone who recognizes so much about the way Scripture was written and how we can understand it best today and understand context. But we wanted to speak to this idea of prophecy, and we're hearing a lot of biblical prophecy. In fact, I just saw an article, 2 out of 5 people in America believe we're living in the end times. The number of Christians who believe we're living in the end times right now is an enormous number, unlike we've seen in modern history. And yet with the thinking about that, it can create a lot of fear. It can create a sense of change or a sense of revelation coming. And people sometimes are excited about that. Other people are completely anxious about that. And the reality is, no man knows the hour. And yet prophecy does speak to a coming moment of the age, of Jesus's return, and when this world will be made new and the full consummation. And so as people look to the future, what is the role of prophecy? Is prophecy only about the future? And so we asked Brad Gray to help us think well about prophecy and about this moment and about God's design for prophecy and what it's meant to do in our hearts, what it's meant to do in our minds. Is it meant to create fear, or is it meant to create confidence? And I think you'll enjoy not only listening to this moment, but this is one of those talks as we move into the Christmas season that your whole family would be deeply encouraged by as we consider the truth of God's word and the way in which it's so brilliantly written and so brilliantly helps us see into a future by recognizing the past.
So Isaiah is saying we're called to live back to the future. And the reason for this is because the future is fuzzy. We all know that. We've all had these times where we are struggling to understand, where is the story going? Where is my life going? What is God doing? And when we become so forward-facing, we get riddled with this sense of anxiety and worry and concern and at times anger because we're struggling to understand what is to come. And it's like Isaiah is saying, exactly. Turn around and be reminded of all the ways in which God has met you in your story. That when you're in these present moments that rattle you, that deeply concern you, that frustrate you and confuse you, Isaiah's like, turn around and be reminded of how God has met you in your story. Because we've had these moments where maybe we were in a similar situation. We go, oh yeah, that's how God met me in this moment. And we were going through this, and then God showed up there, and this happened here, and God showed himself faithful there. And it's also why on a daily basis, we want to anchor ourselves in the scriptures. Because God has shown himself faithful throughout history.
Next up, we invited Faith Yuri Cho to help us be encouraged about the power of God's presence. I mean, if we're listening to Brad Gray and we understand that we look backwards to understand the future and we grow in confidence, we understand the power of God's presence. And faith helped us see that even more, and how much it doesn't matter what kind of tools we have, what kind of technology we have, what kind of enhancements we might dream of or hope to have as human beings. The only thing that matters is God's presence, and it's God's presence that truly moves things forward. And so listen now and be encouraged about the simplest and most basic understanding that we can have about the Christian faith is that God's presence, when he is with us, there is absolutely nothing that he can't do.
In Exodus 33, he hands the promised land to Moses, basically on a silver platter. He says, you and the people go. I'm going to send an angel before you to drive out the enemies. The land filled with milk and honey will be there. He literally offers Moses resources, a strategy, promise fulfilled. But Moses had a discernment that not a lot of us have at times, which is, yes, God can use these things, but it's not God himself. Exodus 33, verse 15. Moses said, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. Perhaps it is because Moses was able to recall that when he had that personal access to God, when he was dealing with the whims of Pharaoh, that's what gave him strength and the guidance. Perhaps he was able to recall that it was the presence of God that split the sea and not his leadership skills or the quality of his staff. Perhaps he was able to recall how it was God that led and fed a nation when they were following a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. He is the resource. He is the strategy. He is the promise fulfilled. I mean, isn't that the essence of the gospel itself? That God loved us so much that what did he do? He gave us himself.
As we shift gears back into what it means to think about our American moment. And for those of you who are international, I think you'll still appreciate the depth of thought that you're about to hear. But we invited a scholar, W.B. Allen, to come be with us. And W.B. Allen is a foremost scholar on George Washington. He's someone who's understood what it means to think about this country as a republic, and to understand terms like democracy that we see thrown around so much in American culture, even from our political leaders who talk about democratic institutions and talk about democracy. But there's this word called republic that sometimes rears its head, and we start to recognize that, wait, there was big conversation about this in the founding of our country about what does it mean to truly be a republic? What does it mean to be represented by people? What does it mean for the people, we the people, to actually carry the authority and the structure that's been given. And so W.B. Allen is asked by one of our guests, Dave Zanotti, questions about this. And you're going to hear his response about this concept of, are we a republic or a democracy? And if we are a republic, how do we think about the way in which we live our lives and the way it must be lived to contribute to that republic flourishing?
But this idea of the republic is not just the idea of representation. It's the idea that somehow it is the authority of the people which is at bottom, the foundation of the government. Not their direct rule, but their authority. And what does that authority consist in? It consists in a responsibility, the responsibility of self-government. So we have a dilemma, a paradox. Self-government doesn't mean majority rule. It means each and every one of us being subject to moral self-government, to self-restraint, to moderation. It means being accountable individually. And the purpose for the idea of the republic is to capture that personal accountability. And where does it come from? Ultimately, we derive it from what was identified at the founding as the freedom of conscience. And when James Madison defined that for us in 1785, he defined it very clearly as the obligation human beings owe to God, which is prior to any obligation to civil society. And so when we're talking about the republic, we're talking about the idea that we have obligations to God first. And our civil relationships are all subordinated to that. And therefore we have to work those out as well as we can.
Well, as we close out with our last moment, my wife Rebecca shared a talk this year called Us versus Them. And this talk was one that resonated deeply with everybody in the room at our Culture Summit, because we're at a moment where there's so much polarization, so much tension, so much us versus them. But is that really the way forward? Is that the way in which we've been called to live? Is that the way in which we're called to relate to our neighbors, even those that we disagree with, even if we have deep disagreements? How is it that we view the other as someone made in the image of God, someone deserving of respect? It doesn't mean we can't confront bad ideas, but we're not just here to confront people. We actually want to engage ideas, because it's the ideas that we believe that start to shape our behavior, start to shape the way we interact in the world, the types of things we create. And if we could actually get back to God, biblically based ideas, then we could have more flourishing taking place around us. Well, Rebecca speaks to this attitude that's become pervasive of us versus them and encourages us and really calls us towards peacemaking. There's not a better way for us to think about this season than what it might mean for us to be the peacemakers, for us to be those that sit at dinner tables with those we disagree with, or maybe family members who've done something that may have hurt or harmed us in the past, or to be around people who just completely have disparaging views of your view as a Christian. And yet, what does it mean to sit in that? What does it mean to still show up? What does it mean to still love, to still care for, to still be the kind of person that is going to be present even in the midst of that type of division and bitterness and confusion, so that people actually see that we don't just leave the room, but we actually show up when it matters.
This is the point, that we remain. Not only do we remain in God, we remain with one another. We remain in relationship. We decide to not leave the room when we hear something we don't like, when we hear something we don't agree with. We decide not to break covenant or break relationship as brothers and sisters. It's in the church and it's outside the church. How do we remain? How do we remain in love? Here's the thing right here. There is no fear in love. Instead, perfect love drives out fear, because fear involves punishment. So the one who fears is not complete in love. The one who fears is not complete in love. Do we need to be that person? Do we need to be, as sons and daughters of God, again, peacemakers who are children of God, do we need to be the ones who fear that involves punishment? We love because he first loved us. And this is how we know we are God's children, when we love God and obey his commands. And these commands are not a burden. We remain. If the seedbed of revival is prayer, I also believe that the seedbed of revival is when we remain.
that we set a tone as a church, as the people, the sons and daughters of God, decide we are going to stay. We're going to stay in relationship with one another. We're reconciled to the Father, reconciled to each other, so that the world outside could see that we did not leave the room when things got hard.
Well, I hope that Q moment was just a reminder of the role we play when we show up, but also that you would use this episode as something as a resource to encourage people right now, this week. Like right now, go down, share this episode, invite other people to listen to this conversation, to not only be thinking about the future of ideas, but to be reminded of how Christian ideas ground us, whether it's forgiveness and what Malcolm Gladwell was discussing, or the ability for prophecy to help us to look back and understand that we can rely and trust God for all the things in the future. We don't need to live with anxiety, or whether it's this idea of peacemaking or parenting, or what it means to think about being creatures with limits and dependencies. All of these things bring us back to core understandings of what it means to be a human being made in the image of God. And I can't think of a better time to remind people of that than right now. Right now, when the enemy's trying to dissuade, be divisive, tempt people away from truly trusting Scripture, from believing that the things in the Word of God actually are true, I can't think of something more encouraging than to let them know it is true. You can rely on it. You can trust it. You can believe it. And in fact, when you do, your peace will grow. Your confidence will grow. Your light will shine. There will be more and more people around you curious about how you're living with such joy in the midst of circumstances that maybe are less than ideal. And so our prayers for you, for those of you who've been a part of this podcast, who've been listening, who've been a part of our communities and our gatherings, is that when we look towards 2023, that you would feel girded up, that you would feel strengthened, that you would feel a sense of very clear calling in the place that God's put you for this moment, in the city that you're in, the neighborhood you're in, wherever it is that God's given you any ounce of influence, that you would see this as part of God's mission to encourage those around you, to take care of those around you, to reach those around you who are going to be asking some of the questions that every human's asked for every age, but they're asked it more frequently as they start to see the things they used to could count on, whether it was money, whether it was an economy, whether it was health, whatever it might be that they're seeing start to fall apart. They're going to look for those who have a steadfastness and a sense of conviction and a sense of understanding that God is with us. And so I hope this encourages you today. I want to remind you in 2023, as you're planning for 2023, join us at our Culture Summit. We have 200 seats remaining, and we would love for you to be a part of that. If you've listened to this and you've been encouraged by it, you will hear 25 9 or 18-minute talks at the Culture Summit. But not only that, you're going to meet other leaders around this country and around the world who are navigating leadership right now in one of the most difficult cultural moments to lead. And we want to support you, resource you, provide you with all of the types of conversations that we know you're going to need to be able to lead really well in the future, and also give you amazing experiences. You're going to come to Nashville and get out in the city. We're bringing back so many of the old ways we used to host this event pre-COVID, where people could come in and enjoy experiences that get you in the city, having conversations around different areas of industry and culture that we know will encourage you, as well as meeting other people who are trying to live faithfully in the midst of this cultural moment. You can learn more about that at qideas.org/culture summit. And I would encourage you, get your seats, bring a couple people on your team. If you're someone that can bring a table of 8, come and host a table of 8 where you not only learn together, but you discuss. And our plans for 2023, there are so many new things we will be introducing for this moment to help you as a leader create these conversations that are of substance and of consequence. I can't wait for you to hear about them, and we will be showing those as we move into 2023, but specifically at this April 27 and 28 Culture Summit in Nashville, Tennessee. So I hope you'll join us there. And if you do take advantage of our offer for 2 tickets before the end of the year, we have an incredible holiday bundle that we're going to send you of gifts, of blankets, of books, of an beautiful art print, many things. It's $500 worth of gifts that we just want to give to you as gifts from those around us that we've curated for you. And so take advantage of that by going to qideas.org/culture summit. And we look forward to seeing you there.